Okay, so today we're going to we're going to start in by talking about what's known as the sensorimotor system. The sensorimotor system. And so we're going to be talking about two basic things that occur both within the brain and the body. Uh, the sensor part is talking about sensation, so the ways in which we pick up different sensations from different parts of our bodies, from our eyes, from our ears, from our sense of touch. So it's the overall sensations that we pick up from the environments that we're in, and then couple that with our motor systems. So our ability to move about and function in terms of walking, grabbing, throwing, anything that we do with our body is our motor systems. And so we're going to be talking about kind of the links between those two and kind of a general functional description of the different brain areas involved, how they work together, and kind of how do we model how these different parts of our brains and bodies actually behave. So we're going to start off by talking about a few principles of how our sensorimotor systems function. And the first principle is that it's hierarchically organized. So in a sense, it's like a large company, and within our brains, we have different areas of our brains which perform different kinds of functions or do different kinds of tasks. So the president of the company, and that would be located or that would be associated with the association cortex, gives a direction to the lower levels. And then the lower levels, things like motor neurons and our muscles, take care of the details. So the president is more kind of standing kind of above everything else and giving more kind of general directions for the kinds of things that he or she might want to see accomplished in the company, and they're more broad based. And then the details are taken on further down the chain, if you will, further down the chain of command within our neurons and our muscles. And so a lot of what happens at the lower levels is often much more of an unconscious process, and the conscious processes are more within places like the association cortex or more kind of upper level sorts of things. The reason why this is so beneficial is because it allows those higher levels of the association cortex to focus on more complex functions. So if you've ever noticed when someone gets good at a certain kind of sport or a certain kind of skill, a lot of what they do, kind of the regular everyday sorts of things, become much more sorts of automatic types of processes, meaning it's working outside of our own conscious awareness. And what that does is it allows time for the president or for those higher levels to focus on other sorts of things, to be able to do other sorts of things, to strategize in different ways that allows that person to be smarter based on the type of task that they're doing. So if you think about a certain kind of athlete, say like a pro athlete, say like a LeBron James, who him and the Lakers just won the latest NBA national championship. He is someone who he is very smart with the ball, meaning that he uses his association cortex to think about and strategize what he's going to be doing with the basketball court, who he's going to be passing to, when he should take a pass, or when he should take a shot. But then the lower levels of his sensorimotor system, things like being able to shoot, making a move towards the basket, doing a layup or a slam dunk, that's all being taken care of by the lower levels. So he has shot so many shots, and this is where practice really comes in. He has shot so many shots over time. He have what you may have referred to this as a type of muscle memory, meaning that you're so good at the basics of what a good shot looks like, you don't have to think about that as much. And once you practice something like that enough, it allows you to use other areas of your cortex or other areas of your brain to focus more on the strategy. Whereas like when you're first learning something, say if you think about something like a car driving, when you're first learning how to drive a car, you're really focused on the brakes and the gas and things like how to turn, when to turn. And so that's why younger drivers are sometimes not as safe because they have so much of their conscious energy is being focused towards those kind of basic skills. But as you get better over time at driving, those kind of things like knowing when to brake, knowing when to turn, knowing how to turn become much more automatic, and that allows you to do more kind of scanning and more strategizing about what's going on. So it helps you in terms of avoiding a potential accident. So that's why our sensory motor systems are geared towards making things that are routine more automatic and trying to decrease the amount of cognitive attention we have to take to those kind of lower level sorts of activities, which allows us to do more. Okay, so the second principle is that motor output is guided by a sensory input. And this is the idea that when we're doing something with our hands or with our legs or walking or whatever it might be, it's guided by our sensation. It's guided by our vision, meaning we look at what we're going to pick up. We look at where we're going to walk. And that sensory information is fed into our motor systems, and those systems work together to output adaptive sorts of behaviors. So our sensorimotor system is always monitoring the external world. We adjust it, we adjust our actions to fit what it is that we're trying to do. And only what are called ballistic movements are not guided by sensory feedbacks. And these are more kind of reflexive sorts of behaviors that you do in more of a reactionary sense. But if you think about, so when I pick up this glass and I take a drink from it, I'm using my vision. I'm using my proprioception to guide the glass to my lips and to be able to do and complete that particular motor function. If you've ever watched a young child try to do it, it's kind of difficult at first because it takes a lot of work to learn how to get it where it needs to be, to get the glass to your mouth, to tip it in just the right amount, to not spill anything. Most kids, when they first start to do those kinds of actions, they'll spill on themselves, they'll spill on their mom or dad, they'll spill on the floor, whatever it might be. And that's because those systems are kind of being geared up. The sensor systems, which are sensing what you're doing with the glass, are learning to incorporate it to what you're doing with your motor actions. And so over time, you become better and better at that, to where you don't have to, when you take a drink now, you don't have to focus on it too much because so much of it is automatic. But if you've ever spilled something, you know that oftentimes you're thinking about something else, you're focused on something else, you're not paying enough attention, and then you end up spilling on yourself. And that's because you've allotted too much cognitive work to doing something else. Or your focus is you have too much attention on some other thing. And that's why there's this interesting balance that occurs in terms of being able to be focused on what you're doing and yet allow those systems that need to be automatic to actually execute their particular automatic functions. So our sensory input helps us with picking things up, as we talked about, adjusting to unanticipated external forces. So if you're catching something or if something starts to fall on you, you can pick it up. And you can maintain a constant force as well. So if you're competing in like a tug of war, your muscles begin to be able to sense when they need to exert more force to try to stop the rope from moving away from you. And those are the systems that are working in tandem to produce different types of motor behavior. And then, of course, finally, what we were talking about earlier is that learning is a part of how we become better at these kinds of skills. So learning changes the nature and the locus of sensorimotor control. So initially, actions are under primarily conscious control, and that's when you're learning to do something in the early stages. And then over time and with practice, they become integrated sequences of action, and then it takes less and less cognitive effort to perform those kinds of actions. And then they become automatically adjusted without having to consciously regulate what you're doing. So just like the first time you learned to bike, or you learned how to ride a bike, it took a lot of time, it took a lot of effort. You were really focused on the pedal, on the pedals, trying not to fall over. Once you become good at that, it takes less and less a conscious effort and conscious attention to accomplish the task of actually riding a bicycle. And you can either focus on other things, you can daydream when you're biking if it's not like a busy intersection or something like that. And that's kind of the trade-off between conscious resources that we have and unconscious, especially motor processes, that will take over for tasks that we learn very well. So as we learn different sorts of things, it requires less and less of a conscious activity, and thus allows us to devote that consciousness to other sorts of tasks or to improve the tasks that we're already doing. So here's the basic model that is kind of the accepted model for how our sensorimotor system actually functions. Number one, it has a hierarchical structure. So more complex processing is taking place at the association areas of the cortex. It has functional segregation, so different parts of your brain and body will perform different sorts of functions. So your muscles are doing one thing, your nerves are doing, you're performing different functions, your neurons are doing something else, and then whole areas of your brain are doing a different kind of function. All those functions, all those, if you will, almost sub-functions, contribute to what it is that you are doing with your body. Those systems work in parallel as well. So the motor commands that are coming down from the association cortex are not coming down a single channel, but several different channels or several different neural networks are actually contributing to the ability to do different kinds of motor tasks. And so multiple circuits are working together at the same time to produce the actions that we have. Then finally, at every level within this hierarchical structure and among the different functions, there are feedback loops. So there's going to be feedback loops and feedback circuits that are feeding back information throughout the hierarchical structure that allow us to do the kinds of complex tasks that we're able to do. So here is a model. Here is an illustration of that model. Here's our top level, which is going to be the association areas of the cortex. Then the next level down would be secondary motor cortex, then primary motor cortex, on down to the brain stem and the motor nuclei within the brain stem, followed by particular muscles that we have, and then different parts of our spinal motor circuits. So these are the different levels, and everything is doing something, some other kind of function, or you can even say a sub-function or a sub-task that contributes to our ability to actually perform a certain kind of a motor action. Then we're getting feedback at each level. Notice these blue arrows. So information is being fed back into the system, and then, as we've talked about before, we're always receiving constant feedback from our sensory systems. And the sensory systems allow us to adjust and modify whatever it is, whatever the motor action that we're trying to do. Now, there's a few different areas of association cortex that we'll be talking about. The first area is the posterior parietal cortex. The posterior parietal cortex. So remember that an association area of the cortex is basically where several different kinds of information are coming in at the same time. Remember, we had association cortex that was involved in a visual processing. That was involved in visual processing as well. And so association cortex is basically a place where everything is coming together for whatever the function is that we're talking about, whether it's vision or, in this case, motor actions. And so each of these play a role in our ability to actually do something. So we'll start with the posterior parietal cortex. And this area provides information on where our bodies are in relationship to the external world. So they give us kind of spatial location information, receives input from our visual, auditory, and somatosensory systems. Each of those areas is being fed, each of those information is feeding information into posterior parietal cortex. The output goes to the secondary motor cortex, and then stimulation of this area makes the subject feel as if they are performing an action. And what's interesting about this kind of research is the feeling is there whether or not you actually did it or not. So you can, stimulation of posterior parietal cortex gives the sensation or the feeling of doing something, even though you didn't actually do it. And that's because once this area is stimulated, it gives that sense, or it's a feeling as if you're kind of giving those types of motor commands that are being sent out to the rest of your body. And that's why you have that sensation that you have. There's a few different kinds of deficits that can be associated with damage to posterior parietal cortex. One is known as apraxia, and this is the inability to perform movements on command. And what's important about this kind of apraxia is that it's not because there's something wrong with your arms or your legs or your muscles or anything like that. It's because once you have damage to this area, the conscious ability to actually perform certain kinds of functions becomes damaged. So your body is fine, but because of the brain damage that occurs, it makes it difficult to perform certain kinds of conscious tasks, and especially things that you are intending to actually do. So a lot of your reflexive sorts of actions, like if a ball is coming towards you fast, if you're trying to avoid something, your unconscious activation of things like an avoidance behavior or something like that, moving out of the way of a ball or moving out of the way of something that's falling down, that's still intact because that's your unconscious. That's your unconscious reflexive sorts of motor actions. But when you have damage to this particular area, it makes it difficult to consciously cause your body and to cause your brain and body to perform certain kinds of actions. This is often associated with damage to the left hemisphere, and the symptoms are bilateral, meaning that it can happen to either side of your body. Another problem that is associated with damage to posterior parietal cortex is what's known as contralateral neglect. Contralateral neglect. And this is the failure to respond to either visual, auditory, or somatosensory stimuli in one part of your visual field or one side of yourselves. This is often produced by very large lesions within the right parietal lobe. And so individuals in this case will only attend to the right side of the body or items on that side of the environment. It's as if they simply ignore what's going on the left side of their bodies or the visual field. And there's been instances of people only eating, like, say, food that's on the right side of their plate, only seeing things or being able to visually process things on the right side. But individuals are capable of unconsciously perceiving objects on the left. And so here again, certain kinds of sensory and motor systems, because they're much more automatic and they're much more unconscious, they are being processed outside of posterior parietal cortex. Thus, as long as other areas aren't damaged, you can still actually perceive something that's there at the unconscious level. You can maybe even reach for it and be pretty successful in terms of a reflexive sorts of things, but consciously, you will not see it, or you will not sense that it's there, or whatever the particular modality that you're looking at is. And that's known as contralateral neglect. And that's where you tend to ignore the left side of your body, of the visual field, of things that you're seeing, because of damage to the right parietal cortex. Okay, so here's a look about the different areas of the brain that are being activated for this particular pathway. Notice there's your light green, which is posterior parietal cortex, and it is, of course, receiving information from the visual cortex, from the auditory cortex, and from somatosensory cortex. Remember, association cortex basically means it's associating a lot of different kinds of information. So it's taking in all different kinds of things and then being a part of sending out certain kinds of motor commands, or playing a role in certain kinds of motor commands. And you can see, although it's not highlighted here in the color, right here is your central sulcus, here's my motor cortex, and then here's my somatosensory cortex. And so posterior parietal cortex is receiving information from all those, and then sending that information up to the dorsolateral prefrontal association cortex, the frontal eye field, and then areas of secondary motor cortex. And this is what's always really interesting about studying the sensorimotor system, is that there's a lot of different areas of the brain involved in these kinds of things. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Okay, next area that we'll be talking about is the dorsolateral prefrontal association cortex. This receives projections from the posterior parietal cortex, which we've already talking about, and it projects to secondary motor cortex, primary motor cortex, and the frontal eye field. So a lot of people would say that the frontal lobe is a lot of where the goals and intentions are being made in terms of different kinds of motor actions. So it's where we set up what it is that we want to do. So we're taking in information from the posterior parietal cortex. We're gaining more information from the frontal lobe, and primarily from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and then we're sending that to our motor systems to begin to execute different types of motor actions. So this area is involved in assessments of external stimuli. So we're assessing what we're seeing out there. We're assessing what we want to do with what's happening within our environment. And this area may work with the posterior parietal cortex in terms of decisions regarding voluntary response initiation. So it's kind of, to a sense, it's where our consciousness arises in terms of trying to initiate a particular kind of response and to send those signals out to the rest of the cortex and the rest of the motor systems that allow us to perform different kinds of actions. So here's that. Here we are looking at the dorsolateral prefrontal association cortex. We'll notice that it projects to areas of a secondary motor cortex, including areas really close to the cingulate, which we see right here. Primary motor cortex here, the frontal eye field, and each of these areas is playing a special role in executing different kinds of motor functions. Now, when we begin to look at secondary motor cortex, there's actually several areas involved. And we're going to be looking at 8 areas that make up what is known as the secondary motor cortex. So there's 2 areas of the premotor cortex, and the premotor cortex is the cortex directly in front of the motor cortex. So remember from before, we have the central sulcus, then we have the motor cortex, then we have the premotor cortex. So it's 2 areas from that. There's 3 supplemental motor areas, and then 3 areas of the cingulate. And remember that the cingulate is the area of the brain that's inside the longitudinal fissure, right above the corpus callosum. And it's that area of a tissue that also has a role to play in executing different types of motor functions. So these areas project to primary motor cortex and each other, as well as the brainstem. They allow us to produce complex sorts of movements before and during certain kinds of voluntary movements. The exact role of these areas is actually not fully clear. And this is one of the interesting things we always know about biological psychology is it's always learning. There's always something new to try to understand. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how all of these areas work. We do know that the premotor areas encode spatial relations and program different kinds of motor movements that are going to be ready for execution. So here's the areas of a secondary motor cortex. Here's our supplementary motor area. Here's primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and then these cingulate motor areas. So those are the primary areas that make up what's known as, in general, as the secondary motor cortex. The new and really interesting discoveries that was originally found in the macaque monkey is the existence of what are called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons. And what's interesting about mirror neurons is there are neurons that fire both when you're observing a particular action occurring, as well as when you perform those same types of actions. So some have suggested this may be a mechanism for a social cognition, and it may be part of the systems that are involved in imitation and mimicking what someone else is doing, mimicking different kinds of motor movements and motor actions, and may be a part of just kind of general of a motor learning, social learning, and several other types of functions. And the way that they actually found out or initially discovered about motor neurons is in working with the macaque. They would notice that when the monkey would pick up, say, like a ball, the same types of neurons within the prefrontal cortex would begin to fire, but then that same exact neuron will begin to fire when they observed one of the experimenters actually doing the same thing. And it happened irregardless of what objects were being picked up. So you'll see here in this example, we have one of the macaques picking up a red ball, followed by the experimenter picking up a red ball. So in the second example, there's an object that wasn't a part of the original type of observed behavior that was observed within the experimenter, and thus there's no activation within the mirror neurons. So this really is an interesting and kind of a real type of breakthrough in terms of understanding the mechanisms that may be involved, both in just kind of imitating what someone else has done, as well as looking into things like empathy, as well as a theory of mind. Obviously, within humans, we haven't been able to directly investigate the same kinds of neurons because we don't do anything that invasive in terms of electrical recording of specific neurons. But there is a certain amount of fMRI research that seems to support the possibility that we have mirror neurons as well, though it may be closer to a type of mirror neuron system. There may be kind of more kind of advanced sorts of cognitive systems that are involved in how we mirror. But there's still going to be a lot of research that will be looking into that as well. So when we move to the primary motor cortex, we'll look at there's been kind of a basic way or a basic framework that the motor cortex or primary motor cortex has been understood. So you remember first that the motor cortex is the cortex of the brain that's directly in front of the central sulcus. So remember we have the central sulcus, then right in front of that, within the frontal lobe, is the primary motor cortex. It's organized based on the body. So it's somatotopically organized. What that means is it's organized based on the soma, or based on our body, in that different areas of our body and the original execution, or the different functions associated with performing different actions, are located on that particular cortex. So the body is diffusely represented on what's known as the motor homunculus. And what that means is it's kind of this in some ways kind of a strange representation of a body, because based on how much motor memory you need, or how much cognitive resources you need to do different types of tasks, it will have a larger representation within that particular motor cortex. So for example, and here we can come down here, if you notice how big the hands are here, why is that the case? And so if you think about your hands, there's so many more fine motor sorts of things that we do with our hands that's very different than what we do with like our shoulder. Our shoulder you just don't do that much with. So what that does is it requires that more area of the motor cortex has to correspond to our ability to do different things with our hands. Because moving the fingers, doing things like typing, holding a pen and writing something, it takes much more fine motor skill to actually perform those types of actions. So because of that, we need, in a sense, more cortex that's going to be devoted towards those kinds of things. And you notice the same kind of things that go on with the face. So there's more things that there's more cortex devoted to the face because we do so much more things with our faces in terms of looking sad, looking happy, looking shy, looking angry. I mean, all these different kinds of facial expressions and all the little muscles that are a part of our face, once again, take more cortex and more cognitive space, which is represented on the cortex, to be able to perform those different kinds of actions. So the body is actually disproportionately represented on our motor cortex based on how much cortex or how much cognitive effort different types of motor actions actually require to properly perform them. Then, of course, each area receives feedback from the muscles and joints. And see, as we've been talking about this entire time, our motor systems are going to be hierarchically organized, and there's going to be a lot of feedback. Feedback systems are what allow us to do different things and to modify whatever the motor action is that we're doing, whether we're walking, whether you're carrying something, all these different things. If you've been carrying something for a while, the longer you carry it, the more strain it's going to put on your muscles. And so you have to judge how you're going to be able to actually keep holding that thing. And two, you're going to have to exert more effort because it requires more time to carry something that's actually heavy. You're going to have to stop that kind of natural sort of thing, which would mean you'd want to drop something or not have to carry it anymore. So there's always going to be feedback that's going to be involved in any type of motor action that we are doing. So different neurons code for the preferred direction of movement. And there's actually been neurally controlled prosthetics that are actually being, they're actually currently being tested. And I do know that there's one study where a person was using their motor cortex to actually move a cursor on a computer screen. And they were kind of just doing those same sorts of commands that you would normally associate with basic sorts of motor skills, but because of damage to other areas of their body, they began to use that same area to control a cursor. There's a lot of really interesting sorts of experiments that are being done on kind of augmenting people's ability to use things like computers or prosthetics to actually do different sorts of tasks. So there are different kinds of problems you can have with primary motor cortex lesions. One is known as contralateral osteoagnosia. And what this does is it reduces the speed and force of contralateral movements. So it kind of takes away from the strength or the force or the exertion of effort that you would normally see based on a normally functioning type of motor output, and it decreases them. It takes away from the strength. You also see that people have an increased difficulty in moving one body part that's independent of others. So say if you wanted to move like your finger like this or move your thumb, obviously trying to kind of distinguish between the parts of my hand versus my entire hand itself takes more effort. Thus, it requires more of the motor cortex. So when you see damage within the motor cortex, that is some of the deficits that you see. What's important here again is this is not because of any kind of a paralysis, meaning there's nothing wrong with someone's hand and their inability to move the finger. It's just a part of the motor system, which would be primary motor cortex, that gets damaged, and thus that particular function has some sort of a deficit, and they have certain kinds of difficulties there. Here's our motor cortex again. Here's that map of different parts of our body and what types of motor functions that they are actually associated with. One thing to remember, as we've seen before, the right motor cortex is going to control left sorts of the motor actions or motor actions that are associated with the left side of the body. The left motor cortex is going to be involved in different types of motor actions involving the right side of the body. So once again, that same kind of a contralateral activity is going to be around. Okay, next we'll look at the cerebellum. The cerebellum is often referred to as the little brain. That's that small brain that's right underneath the cortex. It only has 10% of the brain's mass, but it actually contains over half of the brain's neurons. So there's a lot of different things that are going on within the cerebellum in terms of motor action, even though it's actually technically outside of the cortex. It's actually organized systematically into different lobes, just like the cortex is. It does not transmit signals to the spinal cord, so it doesn't seem to be involved in those kinds of functions, but it does integrate and coordinates activity of the structure in the sensorimotor neuron system. It's almost kind of like a vice president or a second in command that's helping to kind of integrate and clean up different types of motor actions that we do. So it kind of has this kind of secondary role in certain kinds of motor actions. So it receives inputs from primary and secondary motor cortex, brainstem motor nuclei, as well as the somatosensory and vestibular systems. So it corrects deviations from intended types of movements. So it's acting as kind of a cleanup or a secondary or a auxiliary sort of function in terms of our motor actions. It's directly involved in motor learning, as well as many diverse sensory, cognitive, and emotional responses. We're still really learning a lot about the cerebellum. They're still going to take a certain amount of time to understand everything that it's actually involved in. But it seems to have a really important role in kind of fixing, modifying, or making motor actions more exact and more precise. When people experience damage to the cerebellum, there is some deficits that include the loss of the ability to precisely control certain kinds of movement, and that precision that we've been talking about, that is that kind of cleanup or that kind of auxiliary function that the cerebellum seems to provide. There's also an inability to adjust motor output to changing conditions, inability to maintain a steady posture. So you have difficulty kind of staying in the same kind of a posture or the same kind of stature. It's been linked with things like inability to exhibit a coordinated locomotion. So there's a lack of coordination associated with different kinds of motor tasks that seems to be related to damage to this area. Inability to maintain balance, cannot speak clearly, and cannot control eye movements. So in a lot of ways, there can be really kind of really general sorts of motor problems that you'll see when the cerebellum is damaged. And that's because it's playing that kind of secondary role of helping to perfect, to a certain extent, certain kinds of motor actions. Okay, finally, the basal ganglia. This is a subcortical sensorimotor structure. The basal ganglia integrates and coordinates the activity of our sensorimotor structures, receives input from our cortex, and then sends out that information to the motor cortex via the thalamus. So it has certain, if you remember, the basal ganglia is really close to the thalamus and close to the top of the brainstem. And so the basal ganglia is a part of that motor system and a part of both the sending and receiving of different kinds of motor commands. So it helps in terms of the sequence of different kinds of movements, and then as well as varied non-motor sorts of cognitive tasks as well. And once again, we're talking about all this kind of feedback that goes on within the motor system. You're going to see that there is a lot of different tasks that we think about. It's going to involve a lot of different parts of the brain and a lot of different correct execution of different kinds of functions from within different parts of the brain that allow us to do what it is that we do. Okay, so here's a short video that will give us a little bit more information on some of these systems.
Next in the hierarchy of movement control are several subcortical regions. The basal ganglia, which include the caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, substantia nigra, and subthalamic nucleus, are in charge of executing all desired movements communicated from the cortex. Put more simply, if the cortex is the coach creating the plays, the basal ganglia is part of the team responsible for executing those plays. The basal ganglia also control the inhibition of unwanted movements. As you can imagine, the neurons involved in inhibition are constantly at work. If your inhibitory neurons were not working, your arms, head, and legs would jerk and swing in different directions all on their own. Patients with Huntington's disease, for example, display these types of large, involuntary movements because the inhibitory neurons in their basal ganglia have died. The cerebellum controls repetitive movements that require accurate aiming and timing, which are essential for passing the ball and running up and down the court. People with cerebellar damage lose coordination and often appear clumsy, bumping into things and tripping. The cerebellum helps to smoothly guide our movements toward targets. The reticular activating system regulates muscle tone. Without it, you would completely collapse. The brainstem and spinal cord are lowest in the hierarchy. The brainstem and spinal cord relay messages from the brain to the muscles, control posture, and control reflexive movements.
Okay, so that's the end of part one, and we'll move into different types of tracks, as well as talk about the muscles and how muscles work in our next section.